Okay, so for those of us that have been coming along for the past couple of Sundays, we see that the time period that we're looking at, it's about 1000 BC. We're looking at the kingdom of Israel under their second and greatest king, King David, experience the rumblings that precede and then the coup d'etat that initiates Israel's first civil war. And we see that the opposition to King David isn't a general who had his feelings hurt, or it's not someone within the regime, but it's someone from his own family. It's his second oldest son, Absalom, who insists on not waiting for the crown, but taking it, and taking it right now. And so we've seen, ever since chapter 13, we've seen the carefully laid, patient plan of Absalom and his advisor, Ahithophel, carefully plotting to bring down the kingdom of David from the inside. And it is working. We see that David and his followers have evacuated out of the palace and out of the city of Jerusalem, and they're heading east, and they're leaving. And so it has begun. Like I said, a coup d'etat. All in the course of one day, a coup has taken place. They haven't fought yet. Today, we're going to see the first battle in this civil war. Surprisingly, it actually is the only battle in this civil war. This is a war that ends in one day. We're going to see Absalom, who has risen to such prominence and has made such a name for himself. He's going to die very unceremoniously and very ungracefully or disgracefully in a way on the battlefield. This story is told for us, and we are going to be given some numbers and some stuff like that. But really, this is a story about a father and a son set against an unraveling kingdom. So, as I mentioned, we're going to back up a bit and go into chapter 17. So in verses 24 down to 29, we read about the behind-the-scenes advisory meetings, the committee in the war rooms, I guess, as Absalom is planning his first attack against David. Now, certainly he has been engaging in character assassination. He's been tearing him down verbally for years, but now it's time to kill him. And so he asks advice from two different advisors. How should I kill my dad? And that's all of chapter 17, basically, is these two different men giving him different advice as to how he's going to kill his old man. Ahithophel tells him in those early verses of chapter 17 to take a small army, to go really fast, and to do a surgical strike and just kill David and nobody else. That way the losses are minimized. That way that even the troops that were following David will be left alive and then can follow you instead. And that's good advice. I'm not a Civil War advisor or anything, but that seems like good advice. In fact, the Bible even says that's good advice. Hushai, and then Absalom says, okay, that sounds good. Ahithophel says, Absalom, you stay home, I'll lead the charge, I'll kill David myself, you stay here where it's safe, and then we're going to go get David. And then Hushai says, okay, that's not good advice. What you should do is we should get the biggest army you ever saw, and we're going to swarm him. And then he goes on in verses 5 down to verse 15 of chapter 17, describing in the most imaginative language possible the glorious victory of this giant army swarming down upon David and killing him and everyone who supports him. He says, even if David flees to a city, then we'll all surround the city with ropes and we'll tear it down brick by brick and cast it into the sea, and you'll be looked at as the great and supreme conqueror. And Absalom, who is a very prideful young man, says, that sounds great. I love the idea of me at the front of a giant army, just descending upon everything. And so although it won't be as quick or speedy or immediate as the first bit of advice, although it would take longer to prepare, they'd be slower going, he says, you know what? I like that because I'm up in front. I'll go with that. And so he takes the advice of Hushai, not knowing that Hushai is kind of a secret agent, that he's actually on David's side, and he's only advising him this to buy David and his supporters a bit of time to prepare for the battle. And so in those verses we see that Absalom chooses plan B on his how to kill my dad discussion. And then we see the rest of the chapter is the message, the information being brought from the secret war room of Absalom down to David in hiding, so that David has time to ready his troops and to prepare for what's going to happen. And so in 17 verses 15 and following, we see that, it's kind of this network where messages are given from, the sons of the priest to this servant woman and to this, and it's all this intrigue. Anyway, eventually, news reaches David. This is what's going to happen. In chapter 18, we see this. Then David mustered the men who were with him and set over them commanders of thousands and commanders of hundreds. And David sent out the army, 1/3 under the command of Joab, 1/3 under the command of Abishai, the son of Zeruiah, Joab's brother, and 1/3 under the command of Ittai the Gittite. And the king said to the men, I myself will also go out with you. But the men said, you shall not go out, for if we flee, they will not care about us. If half of us die, they will not care about us. But you are worth 10,000 of us. Therefore it's better that you send us help from the city. The king said to them, whatever seems best to you, I will do. And so the king stood at the side of the gate while all the army marched out by hundreds and by thousands. Verse 5 says, and the king ordered Joab and Abishai and Ittai, deal gently for my sake with the young man Absalom. And all the people heard when the king gave orders to all the commanders about Absalom. So David has his new base. Obviously, as I mentioned, he has evacuated from Jerusalem, and he's set up in the town of Mahanaim, I believe it's pronounced. But you guys don't know. No one knows. So he has his new temporary base, and the troops are gathered there. We see that when he left Jerusalem, he had about 600 supporters with him, but obviously it has grown in great numbers since then. We read about commanders of hundreds, commanders of thousands. We read about, they talk about how he's worth more than 10,000 men. So perhaps David's troops have swelled. The loyal people were really large in number. Not as large as Absalom's army, but large nonetheless. So he divides the army into 3 different sections. He's about to go out with them, and they're like, no, David, you stay here. This is not a battle of territory. This is not a battle of national defense. I guess it'd be nice to have you leading us, but this whole thing is about you staying alive. And so the best part of you staying alive is you being safe. So you stay here. And they say if things go south, then you can maybe send support from the city, but we would like you to stay here because we're here to keep you safe. And so they prepare for battle, but as they're leaving, David's there at the gate, and he's kind of saying goodbye to everybody. He gives advice, not in private, but in public. And of course, it's not advice, it's an order. He says, guys, deal gently with Absalom for my sake. The commander of the army that wants to kill me is my son, and I want you to deal gently with him for my sake. Take him captive if possible. Do not kill him is what he's asking. And they go to battle. And as I mentioned, this is the first and only battle of this civil war that has been building for so many chapters, for so many years. And as important to this battle is, we see it only gets 3 verses out of a long chapter. Only 3 verses are given to this battle, and I'll read them for you here. So the army, verse 6, went out into the field against Israel, and the battle was fought in the forests of Ephraim. And the men of Israel were defeated there by the servants of David, and the loss there was great on that day. 20,000 men. The battle spread over the face of all the country, and the forest devoured more people on that day than the sword. So as I said, only 3 verses to describe what sounds like a very epic and very important battle. And then even of those 3 verses, 2 of them are about the train. So we have very little strategy and very little information about the battle itself, but just basically that a battle was fought, a lot of people died, David's army won, and there's this line which sounds like it's from J.R.R. Tolkien or something like that. The forest devoured more people than the sword. And as I read that, my mind wanders, I guess, to that scene from Lord of the Rings, when Treebeard, the leader of the Ents, those giant trees, when he says, "A wizard should know better," and then all the trees start walking and, but that's not what happens. It didn't happen like that. I'm just saying that's where my mind went. But there are ancient Jewish manuscripts of this passage. They're not as old as the undergirding text for the Bibles that we have now. So they're fairly young. They're in the textual history, but they have a word that's added to here. I'm only going to say it just because I think it's interesting. They don't say the forest devoured more people that day than the sword, but this says the forest animals devoured more people than the sword. So perhaps that's either an old tradition or something that the animals are incredibly unfriendly in that area. So maybe it's the terrain that's hard, or maybe there's the animals, we don't know. But just as much as when we read in the book of Exodus, when the people of Israel passed through the Red Sea, it also says there's a short verse in there that says, that the Lord was disassembling the wheels of the chariots, that he was giving them a little help along the way to make sure that they made it across. Perhaps the Lord is helping in some supernatural way there in the forest. We know that Absalom had a larger army than David did. But we do know that David had the most loyalist of the troops, that he was a soldier himself. He was a general before he was a king, and he has this fierce loyalty of the soldiers. And so he has a smaller but a better trained army. And so they're not fighting in these open fields, where it's a matter of might or outnumbering one another, but it looks like it's what we'd call like guerrilla warfare, or it's hid. It's small little skirmishes where the skill of the few beats the numbers of the many. Perhaps because they were forewarned, they were able to set up booby traps or whatever. Again, we don't know, but we read that 20,000 died, and that's a huge number. Most of them, it's been suggested, were just kind of farm boys, people that thought that the battle would be exciting, that thought that Absalom is such a charismatic leader, and he invites them along. And so it's maybe an army of just untrained men fighting against skilled warriors in battle. And like I said, I'm going to say that again, 20,000. Like that, I can't, my mind doesn't go that big. It's like, a sixth of the population of Cork? It's a lot of people to die in one day, in one battle, in one expansive forest. And then to think that those deaths are on the hands of essentially 2 men. I believe Ahithophel and Absalom, the beginner and the sustainer, I guess, of this rebellion, they really have this on their hands. They started this war. They pushed into this war. And this incredible loss of life comes, I believe it's laid on the doorstep of the ones that started and perpetuated it. In the New Testament book of James, James 4:1 asks a very simple question. It says, where do wars come from? And of course, there's socioeconomic factors, and we could have a very big, and college classes and books and PhDs have been written on that where do wars come from. But James quite simply says that they come from desires, they come from covetousness, they come from a lack of God's wisdom. And then here we see, although Ahithophel has a reputation of being wise, he's lacking God's wisdom. And he's starting and pushing this war, and 20,000 people died. In Hebrews chapter 12, we talked about this last Sunday at length, focusing on the bitterness of Ahithophel, but I'm going to repeat it again. Hebrews 12:15 says, see to it that none of you falls short of the grace of God, and that no root of bitterness springs forth or takes root, because from it many can spring up and cause trouble, and because of it many will be defiled. We talked about that root of bitterness that was there in Ahithophel and surely in Absalom as well, and how there's a springing up and a trouble causing. And we talked last chapter about how 10 people were defiled because of the bitterness of Ahithophel and Absalom. That's tragic, 10 tragedies. And then here we read about 20,000 people being destroyed on account of the bitterness that was nursed by two powerful men. Now certainly, I do believe God wants to work and is working among us, and it's great to hear testimonies and be talking to people throughout the week of God working through bitterness in us. And I'm not saying, if you don't deal with this, 20,000 people are going to die. I'm not trying to fearmonger or lie or exaggerate. I'm just saying it happened once. But there's a tragedy that bitterness may destroy 20,000 people, or it could destroy the same person 20,000 times. And so here's just another reminder of what I believe one of the things God is doing amongst us is uprooting the dangerous and grace-suffocating work of bitterness. In Hebrews 12:15, it says, there's two options. You can have the grace of God, or you can have bitterness. I don't think there's room for both in our hearts. But this section is not about the 20,000 that died. This chapter, the focus of it is on one death. We see that from verse 9 all the way down to verse 18, it describes one death. Not that the 19,999 others weren't important, but the focus is on the death of Absalom. And I'm going to read a few of those verses and then make some comments. Verse 9 says, Absalom happened to meet the servants of David. Absalom was riding on his mule, and the mule went under the thick branches of a great oak, and his head caught fast in the oak, and he was suspended between heaven and earth, while the mule that was under him went on. And so here we see the stage being set for the death of Absalom. So he's riding his mule in. We'll talk about the mule later. But he's riding his mule into battle. And it says that he encounters some of the servants of David. And so there's a chase. And we don't say whether it's Absalom chasing them or them chasing Absalom. I imagine that he's being pursued. Because again, in my mind's eye, he's being pursued, he's running, he's kicking the mule, making him go as fast as he can, and he's looking backwards because he's being chased. I believe if he was following somebody, he'd be paying attention to where he's going. But the way I imagine it, he's running as fast as his mule can carry him, he's looking backwards, and then just smacks into a tree, a great oak, as the ESV says, a terebinth, as some other Bible translations render it. I just like the word terebinth. And there he smacks full force into a tree, and he becomes entangled in it. Now again, cultural reference. I'm trying to be more cultural. I don't know what Star Wars movie it is, but there's the one where they're on the Ewok planet, and there's the stormtroopers, and they're on those motorbike things, and they're zooming between the trees, and they're chasing. Well, they just run into the trees, and poof. Anyway, that's how I imagine it, only slower and on a mule instead. But so he smacks into this tree, And it says that he is stuck there. And verse 9, it says that he is suspended between heaven and earth. It would be a beautiful way of putting it if it wasn't such an ugly reality. But suspended between heaven and earth. And he's completely vulnerable, utterly defenseless, and just awaiting the time when he's going to be discovered. Because again, he probably was being chased when this happens. And then as he's there, flailing around, knowing, okay, they're going to catch me, any minute. And there he is, just waiting. And many people have read this and supposed that it's his hair that caused him to be trapped in the tree. The reason being is that way back in chapter 14, when it describes Absalom, attention is paid to how long and luxurious and famous his hair is. Chapter 14 says this, "Now in Israel, there was no one to be praised for his handsome appearance as much as Absalom." Good-looking guy. "From the sole of his foot to the crown of his head, there was no blemish in him. And when he cut his hair, he weighed the hair of his head, and it was 200 shekels by the king's weight," which is about 2.5 kilograms or 5.5 pounds, if that makes more sense to any of us. It talks about how he had this yearly routine where he would shave that year's growth of his hair, and that it always was quite a bit. And so he was a good-looking guy, long, famous hair that everyone knows about and comments on. And, many suppose that the reason why it even says it in chapter 14 is because it's so important here in chapter 18, ultimately causing his death. I got to say, it doesn't say it in chapter 18, but I believe it's a fair assumption for us to make. So assuming that his hair was the cause of his undoing, I think that teaches us a lesson or two. And that lesson has nothing to do, gentlemen, with the length of your hair. So I'm not here to give any fashion tips or whatever. But I think there is some, common sense. Or we see a bit about Absalom, and then I think there's some application here for us as well. So I believe it was the Romans. They were the first army that began insisting on what we call the crew cut, I guess, now. Whereas the style, it wasn't necessarily that guys would have longer hair, but if you were in the army, you had to. Because in hand-to-hand combat or in close combat, if you give something for someone to grab onto, that puts you at a disadvantage. That then is bad news for your side of the war and everything. So the Roman army began insisting on crew cuts. And most armies in most places insist on the same type of hair. But then, as I mentioned earlier, so Absalom, he's the best-looking guy in the country. He's famous for his long hair. That's his brand identity. That's his thing, And so when he's going into battle, he doesn't want to blend in. He doesn't want to, however practical it is, however safe it might make him. He's like, well, no, that's my thing. I'm the guy with long hair, and so I'm going to go into it. And of course, when this plan B was given to him by Hushai, I'm sure he just could imagine himself, there riding with his hair behind him, flowing, and bringing an end to David and to David's whole kingdom. And so that's just how he pictured it. And so, however foolish it is practically, he's like, well, that's just how it's going to be. And again, as I picture him, suspended between heaven and earth. He's in battle. I'm sure he has a sword or a knife or something sharp, and he's there. And don't you want to shout at him use the knife and cut your hair? Come on. And we don't know. He doesn't seem to try. Again, perhaps I'm reading too much into the text, but he had this, which is for him a sign of his glory. But then an opportunity came for him to either stay alive or keep his hair. And he chose to keep his brand identity, keep himself. There's an old, my dad used to listen to these like old time radio cassettes, like the radio programs back in the day. And I really liked them. I still do. And I don't listen to them anymore, though. Sad. Sorry, I'm just thinking out loud. But I love it. There was this the characters were walking down the street, and then this mugger jumps out and, points a gun. Well, he has to say, "I'm pointing a gun at you," because it's audio. Anyway, he says, long story short, he says, "Your money or your life." And then the guy who's kind of famous for being very, very, mean or cheap, he's like, "Your money or your life." And then he says it again. "Didn't you hear me? Your money or your life?" And he says, "I'm thinking it over." Anyway, so when Absalom is perhaps forced into the same kind of choice, he thinks it over. And we're going to see that he is suspended there for a long time. So his greatest source of pride becomes his eventual undoing. And of course, today is the 17th. Yesterday was the 16th, and I'm reading a proverb every day. And so yesterday in Proverbs 16, it says, "Pride goes before destruction, and a haughty spirit before a fall." Proverbs 16:18. And so the source of Absalom's pride became, I guess, a forerunner to his destruction, perhaps even the means thereof. And so, I don't know how to apply this, but just be careful that the source of our pride does not become the source of our undoing. Just like Narcissus in the Greek mythology of old, he would rather sit and stare at a reflection of himself, enamored with his own beauty, so much so that he forgot to eat and eventually starved to death. May we not take even the gifts of God, the good blessings that God's given to us, but then elevate them into something that becomes our very own undoing. So there he is, suspended between heaven and earth, in actual, kind of limbo, poetically speaking anyway. And the mule that he was riding on, I said I'd come back to the mule, which no doubt would have come from David's own stable, because he took over the palace. Mules, believe it or not, were a sign of royalty and nobility. If you remember back in chapter 13, when Absalom killed his brother Amnon, and all of the brothers, all the other princes, they run away, it says they got on their mules and they got out of there. So it's just kind of a sign of royalty, a sign of being of noble birth. But again, it's not a war horse. It's not something you go into battle with. So he is, it's like driving a Rolls Royce, into the deserts of the Middle East, into to battle or something like that. It's just, it's prestigious looking, but it's not functional. So just like from his hair to what he was riding, it was all just this big pomp and ceremony show. Anyway, but so there he is, hanging by his head, hanging by his hair, and then it says that the mule had left him. And again, there's that symbol of kind of royalty and nobility. And you can just imagine him, and he's all tangled up there, and he watches it trot off. And he just knows that is any hope that I have ever becoming king. I can't do a thing about it. And there it goes off. And again, he's hanging there between heaven and earth. And again, I'm getting a bit allegorical, but he is unable to get to heaven or to earth. He's not able to ascend to the throne that he was trying. He's stuck. And then also, he can't go back down to being a prince, which he was before. And so he's just stuck. And his whole problem was that he was trying to get too high, unwilling to wait, unwilling to stay there. And anyway, so we read in the next verses that somebody observes him, hanging, kicking, yelling, trying to get the donkey to come back, or the mule to come back. Anyway, we see in verse 10, a certain man saw it and then told Joab, "Behold, I saw Absalom hanging in an oak." Joab said to the man, "What? You saw him? Why then did you not strike him there on the ground? I would have been glad to give you 10 pieces of silver and a belt." The man says, even if I felt in my hand the weight of 1,000 pieces of silver, I would not reach out in my hand against the king's son. For in our hearing the king commanded you and Abishai and Ittai, for my sake, protect the young man Absalom. Joab, verse 14, Joab says, well, I'm not going to waste time like this with you. He took 3 javelins in his hand and thrust them into the heart of Absalom while he was still alive in the oak. And 10 young men, Joab's armor bearers, surrounded Absalom and struck him and killed him. So this nameless man spots him and then comes back and tells Joab. Joab says, you should have killed him. And the man says, didn't you hear our king? Our king said not to do that. And Joab says, whatever, I know what's best. And then he goes and kills him. And, well, thank you. And so Joab is this interesting character. We've seen him, disobey David before. And we've seen him act incredibly brutal. In chapter 4. We'll see it again in chapter 20. Very much just a mercenary type guy. He gets the job done, but he doesn't really listen to orders very well. So he has no problem disobeying the king. He takes these 3 javelins or these spears, and he uses Absalom like target practice or like a dartboard or something. And these 3 spears go into him, and then his 10 assistants or armor bearers come and just hack him to death, Some ancient commentators have maybe made a connection between the 10 women that Absalom publicly defiled on the palace roof, and then these 10 men that attack him there in the woods. Be that as it may, we see that Joab says that he's better dead than alive. Even though King David wants him alive, you know what? He needs to die, and I'm going to be the one that's going to override King David and put him to death myself. He doesn't want him to be like Napoleon, who was exiled for a while, gathered troops again, and then came back to go to battle. He says, this ends now. David might be a softie. David might have, a heart that goes out to you, Absalom, but I don't. You're dead. And so there he puts him to death. In 16 to 18, we read about the legacy of Absalom. In verse 18, it says that Absalom, in his lifetime, or back when he was alive, he had taken and set up for himself the pillar that's in the king's valley. For he said, I have no son to keep my name in remembrance. He called the pillar after his own name, and it's called Absalom's monument to this day. So while Absalom was alive, he built this monument to himself so that he would always be remembered in the king's valley, trying to build a case for himself that he's a great king, and that's going to be his memorial. But then we read in verse 17, they took Absalom and they threw him into a great pit in the forest, and they raised over him a very great heap of stones. And all Israel fled, everyone to his own home. So we see Absalom's pride again, not just in his hairstyle or in his transportation choice, but in him like the pharaohs of Egypt, building this monument to himself to ensure that nobody forgets him after he goes. He says, like, my family is not enough, my legacy isn't enough, I need this monument to myself to make sure that I'm remembered. It says here that he has no sons to carry on his name. Chapter 14 says that he had 3 sons and a daughter. So either they all died in their youth before they carried on his name, or perhaps he just thinks they're not worthy of his name, and that he's going to build a great monument to himself that's going to outlast any or all of them. So he'd rather be commemorated in this stone pillar than through the lives of his kids. If that's the case, then he's not the first nor the last dad that pours their life into some monument for themselves when perhaps they'd be better off investing in their kids, who are their monument, who are their legacy. Anyway, Absalom wanted to be reminded as this great king, but instead he dies this shameful, cursed death on a tree, buried in a pit, and then covered in stones. The book of Deuteronomy says that it is an incredible shame to die while hanged upon a tree. And then also being covered in stones is another reminder to Deuteronomy and Exodus, where it talks about that judicial sentence from God for disobeying his laws of being stoned. And so here we have this double curse imagery with the death of Absalom. And there's the monument that he built before he died. And it existed, even to this day, it says, upon the writing of the book of Samuel. And so there is this monument that existed in their day that was a remembrance of Absalom. And if you visit Jerusalem now, there is another pillar that's called Absalom's Pillar. Archaeologists, they say it's not old enough to actually be this one. So it seems like, it's just kind of a tourist trap or something where, they say it's at least 2,000 years old. So a very long time ago, someone said, let's call this Absalom's Pillar because the other one's gone. Anyway, so it's there. There is a memorial to it. And the citizens of Jerusalem, people that live around there, Jews, Christians, Muslims, there's a tradition that when you go by it, you pick up a stone and you throw it at it. It's just the reminder of the death of Absalom. So he wants to be remembered in glory. And then it's just there as target practice it's this ecumenical target practice. And I was also reading about it, and it's something that, Jewish moms and dads throughout the past 2,000 years, when their little son, their little daughter is being bold, they say, come with me, come on. And they bring them out to the monument and say, this is what happens to rebellious children. and so, Absalom is very much interested in being remembered in glory. But all that's left is a tourist trap named to him that gets thrown rocks at it and that bold kids are warned by the sight of. And so here we read, I'm going to summarize, I guess, verses 19 down to 30. It's kind of a long process of the news eventually reaching David. So there's two different people with Joab who volunteer or are willing to run and carry the news to David of this. One of them is the son of the high priest Zadok. So, this kind of Hebrew of Hebrews, this pure, Jewish guy, he wants to do it. And then there's another guy, anonymous, we don't know his name, but he's a Cushite, which means that he is a Gentile. But we know the region of Cush is what we call Ethiopia these days. So he's from very far off. And so both of them are kind of saying, I want to go. And he's like, fine, you can both go. And so they go, and they eventually bring the news to David. And there's a bit of confusion. They don't have their stories straight. But eventually, we skip down to the verse 31, and the news finally reaches David that his son Absalom has died. They won the war, but he lost his son. Verse 32, the king said to the Cushite, is it well with the young man Absalom? And the Cushite answered diplomatically, may the enemies of my lord the king and all who rise against you for evil be like that young man. So in essence, he says, is my son alive? And he says, no, he's not. And may all of your enemies meet the same fate that Absalom met. And he gets this news, and he is, of course, grieved. Let me just read verse 33. And the king was deeply moved and went up to the chamber over the gate and wept. And as he went, he said, oh, my son Absalom, my son Absalom, would I had died instead of you, O Absalom, my son, my son. And then skipping to verse 4, the king cried out with a loud voice, oh, my son Absalom, O Absalom, my son, my son. Verse 33 and these things, they're almost unpreachable. I would say that myself, as a teacher or preacher, it's just like, what can I add to this? We're like approaching like the sacred ground of a father mourning for his son. I don't want to try to like add something interesting about the Hebrew text that underlies this, or I don't want to cheapen this by turning it into like a list of tips or principles for living. I just want to like observe, and we listen in on David's grief. I think I said that myself as a preacher, it's hard. I would say that the artists are perhaps even more gifted in the ability to communicate that. Singers or painters can communicate this better than preachers or teachers, I think. Again, it's kind of a feeling. It's a guts rather than a brain. It's a heart rather than words to communicate this. And there's a whole kind of motif of paintings. And this is, of course, obviously based on one of them, of David receiving the news of his son Absalom's death. And there's many songs that have been written about this. David hearing news of the death of Absalom. Some of the most heart-rending songs that I've ever heard have been basically taking verse 33 and applying music to it. David, who didn't grieve when his infant son died because he knew that he would see his son again one day, now can't stop grieving because his adult son, who rebelled against him and everything holy, has now died, and David fears and knows that he's never going to see him again. So his cries were not private. They were loud and they were public, and they were heard by all of the army. And they lasted from the time that the two messengers, the son of the high priest and the immigrants from Cush, they told him the news. And up until we read in the next chapter, the armies return, Joab is there, and Joab has to eventually stop it. So Joab comes home from a victory, from a hard-fought battle, no doubt, with exhausted troops. And they come home expecting the ticker-tape parade, expecting pats on the back, at least like a cup of water, but their king is just upstairs crying. And we read in verse 5, Joab came into the house of the king and said, "You have today covered with shame the faces of all your servants, who have this day saved your life and the lives of your sons, your other sons, your daughters, the lives of your wives and your concubines, because you love those who hate you and hate those who love you. You've made it clear today that commanders and servants are nothing to you. For if all of us were dead today, then you would be pleased. Now therefore arise, go out, and speak kindly to your servants. For I swear by the Lord, if you do not go, not a man will stay with you this night. That will not be worse, and it will be worse for you than all the evil that's come upon you from your youth until now." Verse 8, the king arose, took his seat at the gate, and the people were all told, "Behold, the king is sitting at the gate." And the people came before the king. So Joab, who, he respects David, but not that much. He tells it to him straight, though, too. He's like, listen, like some of our troops have died. It's been hard. There's like amputees back there, and you're crying over their enemy. So knock it off. And David wisely listens to him and resumes his seat at the gate. He says, you're not just the father of a slain son today. You're also the leader of an army and the king of Israel. So you need to fulfill your role, and you need to go and do it and be the leader the people need right now. And so David chose to have his public grief return to a private grief and then resume his public role as the king, sitting at the gate once again. So this reminds me of something that the books of Samuel began with. And I'm aware of time. Actually, I'm not aware of time. I know that it's too long, though. But in the very beginning of the book of 1 Samuel, there was another father that was sitting by the gate awaiting news from battle. It was the high priest Eli. And Eli was, a good enough dad of a bad son. He got two bad sons, actually. And so they're off to war. And it says that Eli is sitting at the gate, and his heart was quaking within him, just full of nerves about the battle and the Ark of the Covenant and his sons. And then someone runs and reports the news to him. And the news is, your sons are dead, the Ark is taken. And he quite literally falls in grief, never to rise again. And then the nation of Israel, which was already in a dark time, goes into greater darkness. Because of the fall of the high priest, of the leader, he falls and never rises again. Here we see Israel in a great time of turmoil and darkness. We see David experiencing tremendous grief, and he falls. But he comes again. He resumes his place in the gate and says, there's more to be done than for me to simply nurse my wounds. As painful as they are, he says there's more to be done. And so he then takes the lead and brings Israel through this crisis, and through the next couple crises, I'm afraid, but then into greater and greater things. And so it's interesting how we see at the beginning of the book, and then here towards the end, we have the same situation, one falling never to rise again, one falling and rising again and taking leadership. And so we see that. It's an interesting contrast. But of course, this also reminds me not just of another father, but also of another son. A son that also goes by the title of the Son of David. And of course, I'm speaking about the Lord Jesus Christ. And Jesus Christ, the ultimate, the promised Son of David, is looking to establish a kingdom and is actively recruiting for his kingdom. But he's doing so not by stealing citizens from a good king, but by rescuing slaves from the prince of darkness, from the prince of the power of the air, Ephesians chapter 2 says. So the Son of David, the real Son of David, is increasing his kingdom, not by deception, but by truth, by light shining in the midst of darkness. The true Son of David was also hung on a tree, not because of his own foolishness, not because he was looking back to see who was chasing him, caught by surprise by a tree that he did not see, but the true Son of David, with full awareness and full knowledge, took up his cross and marched to the place of his own execution. He did so willingly. John 19, Jesus says, "No one takes my life, but I offer it up willingly." And he did so on a tree. We've been quoting 1 Peter chapter 2, verse 23 and 24 nearly every week lately, and it's worth repeating because it says that when Jesus was persecuted, he did not revile in return. When he was cursed, or when he was abused, he didn't lash out in anger, but he entrusted himself to him who judges justly. The next part, verse 24, says, "He himself bore our sins in his body on the tree." And so here we read about Jesus, the sin-bearing substitute, bearing our sins upon a tree. Galatians chapter 3 makes reference to Deuteronomy, which I've already made reference to earlier on in the sermon, about there's a curse that's associated with hanging on the tree. And the Apostle Paul says, Jesus Christ was cursed. He bore the curse of the law that we might be brought into the wonderful freedom of God's grace and forgiveness. And Jesus was cursed upon a tree that we can be blessed. And he died, the Son of David died, not in the midst of his sin, but for the sake of other people's sins. In verse 19, we have that heartfelt cry of King David. "Would that I would have died instead of you." And that cry is just a prefigurement of the true Son of David, who looks at us and looks at us in our sin, in our rebellion, and says, "I will die instead of you." And instead of sending heaven's army out, he himself comes and he dies instead of us. And as Romans 5, verse 8 says, that God demonstrates his love towards us in that while we were still sinners, Christ died for us. While we were in the very act of rebellion, he says, would that I would die instead of you. Let's pray. Father in heaven, I thank you for the Son of David. Thank you for the Lord Jesus, who is almost far too good for us and to us. And Lord, that's what grace all is about. Thank you that you came and rescued and died on behalf of rebels. Lord, I do pray that we can, as much as we are pointed towards the perfect Son of David, that we can also be learning from the flawed Son of David, from Absalom. Lord, I pray that which we treasure the most, that which perhaps even is a gift from you, that we never would elevate that to the point of our own destruction or even the harm of others. Father, I know you've gifted us in a variety of ways. I know that amongst us there probably is so many individual things that you might be putting your finger on. But Lord, I do pray that we'd be willing to relinquish and to release and to lay at the altar that which we're clinging to, even to our own destruction. Lord, and I do pray again, Lord, that whatever root of bitterness that we are clinging on to, that we are allowing us to turn us against those whom we should be facing, Lord, would you uproot it? Would you please, Lord, allow us to make room for the grace of God and have that uproot that root of bitterness? That's my hope and my prayer, God. Please work among us. In Jesus' name I pray. Amen.